Well, President Zelensky was elected to government.
Yeah, you got a brand new guy coming in. In fact, he had just been, I believe, sworn in the day you approved the dollars. Was it May 23rd? I think he was sworn in on, I guess it was a couple days before. But there's sort of a change in circumstances that it seemed to me would warrant at least maybe a second look. And that's exactly what played out for a short time, less than 2 months, 55 days. Our government evaluated the new situation, pretty radical change. You got a new government. In fact, the previous one, we've heard all kinds of things from the Democrats about the prosecutor general in the Poroshenko regime, Mr. Lutsenko, and how bad he was. So it took a while for that all to happen. New president's sworn in. 2 months later, the new Congress comes in. Takes them a while to. It's not until September 5th, that they get rid of this prosecutor. And just a few days later, the aid actually gets released. But the Democrats got all kinds of other things they want to talk about. But the way this played out seems to me as logical as you can do it, and particularly when you put it in the broader framework of where this president is on concern about foreign aid, his deep-rooted concern in the corruption issue in Ukraine, the experience he had with high-ranking Ukrainian officials criticizing him and supporting Secretary Clinton in the 2016 election. Put all that together, sort of, I think, shows why it played out the way it did. With that, I would yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undersecretary Hale, I want to go back to your support and affirmation of Ambassador Yovanovitch. What I understand, and by the way, thank you for that. You know, our military leaves no soldier on the battlefield, and I think those who are in leadership positions in the State Department and our intelligence community have that bond of loyalty to each other, and it's very reassuring that you represent that. You first, as I understand it, got information about her situation in March. By early March, Secretary Pompeo had mentioned that sometime in the fall he'd received a letter from a former member of Congress with complaints about the ambassador, correct? And that member of Congress was?
Congressman Sessions.
And did you see that there was any basis to the claims of disloyalty?
No, I did not, nor did the Secretary of State.
All right. And you visited Kyiv, and you discussed, in fact, extending Ambassador Yovanovitch's term until to remain at her post, right?
It was a personal idea of mine, yes.
Obviously, an indication that you valued her continued service there. And you also stated to the Ukrainian press that Ambassador Yovanovitch represents the President of the United States here in the Ukraine, and America stands behind her statements, obviously trying to give her some public support, correct?
Correct.
And yet, weeks later, the President and Mr. Giuliani unleashed what can only be characterized as an ugly smear campaign to oust her. What was your reaction to the news articles in late March in which a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor attacked the ambassador?
Well, we were concerned. We put out a statement that some of these allegations were an outright fabrication as they related to the do not prosecute list.
Right.
And we began to discuss what we could do to deal with this matter.
Right. And then the problems continued for Ambassador Yovanovitch. And as I understand it, she emailed you on March 24th and indicated that, quote, the tempo of social media and other criticisms were such that she felt she could no longer function unless there was a strong statement of defense of her from the State Department. Is that correct?
Correct.
And this message, and Secretary Pompeo was aware of her situation. Is that correct?
Yes, I briefed him the next day.
And he's the ultimate authority who could issue that strong statement of support, correct?
Correct.
But he never, ever did issue a statement, right?
We did not issue a statement at that time.
But in fact, you testified around the same time that the Secretary did not render assistance to a long-serving and highly respected ambassador he made 2 phone calls to Rudy Giuliani. Is that right?
It's correct that I've seen a record that he made those phone calls.
One on March 28 and again the next day on March 29.
I saw the record of that, yes.
Right. So we don't know what he said to Rudy Giuliani, but we have a pretty good idea what Rudy Giuliani said to him. Get rid of Yovanovitch. She was gone and the statement never came forward, right?
Correct.
And when she was recalled and wanted to find out what happened, Secretary Pompeo would not meet with her?
I was out of the country at the time. I can't comment on that.
All right. Well, and then Mr. Breckbuell, who was next in line, didn't meet with her?
I don't know this.
Well, then it came for you to give her the news.
It went to the deputy secretary, I believe, held the meeting. I was on foreign travel at the time.
Well, it'd be interesting if we could have Secretary Pompeo be here to tell us what his conversations were with Rudy Giuliani, the person who was fomenting the discontent about an ambassador who was fighting corruption. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Ms. Cooper for your service.
Mr. Maloney.
Hello, Ms. Cooper. Hello, Secretary Hale. Ms. Cooper, thank you for working late on a Wednesday. I think the last time we attempted to hear your testimony, the Republicans were good enough to bring pizza down to the skiff. But kidding aside, I know we detained you for about 5 hours that day, so on behalf of the committee, thank you for your forbearance. We do appreciate your patience with us. Quick question for you, and I think just one question for you, Secretary Hale. Ms. Cooper, was DOD able to put all the security system funds into contract before the end of the fiscal year?
No, sir.
And how much were they not able to obligate? What was left unobligated?
I believe the figure was 35 million. We were able to actually obligate 88% total.
And I think you mentioned that you were able, because of legislation the Congress passed, continuing resolution, to do that. Is that right?
So the remainder, we are in the process of obligating right now
the remainder.
because of the provision in the continuing resolution.
Right. So, but for literally an act of Congress, you couldn't have spent all the money.
If we had not received the provision in the continuing resolution, we would have obligated 88%, but not the full amount.
Right, which of course would be a violation of law to not spend money that Congress appropriated.
Sir, I am not a lawyer, but that is my understanding.
Sure. Thank you. Secretary Hale, where were you born?
Ann Arbor, Michigan.
And is your family from Ireland? Am I right about that?
No, sir.
I'm sorry. Strike it. Another question. With respect to Secretary Yovanovitch, you served as ambassador to, I believe, 3 countries?
Correct.
Jordan,
Lebanon,
Pakistan,
and Pakistan.
Lebanon. And while you were ambassador to those 3 countries, did anyone ever ask you to issue a support praising personally the President of the United States?
No.
How would you have viewed such a request?
It would depend on the situation, sir.
If someone said, say you went to someone and you were having a problem with your job and you said, how can I do better? And they said you should publish something personally praising the President, flattering to him. Would that strike you as unusual?
Yes.
If someone told you to go big or go home, would that change your mind?
I don't quite understand the...
Well, that's what Ambassador Yovanovitch was treated to when she went to Ambassador Sondland seeking advice. And she declined to do so. I believe she said it would strike her as too political. Is that consistent with the approach you might take?
I thought that sounds sensible, yes.
Thank you. Yield the remaining time back to the chairman. Thank you both for being here.
Ms. Demings.
Ambassador Hale, Ms. Cooper, thank you both for being with us. Just a quick question before I get into some questions about Ambassador Sondland, who we heard from today. I want to ask both of you, if President Trump withheld critical military aid from Ukraine because high-ranking officials supported the president's political opponent, would you consider that an official, acceptable, appropriate action by the President of the United States? Ambassador Hale?
It's not what I would advise.
Ms. Cooper?
No, that does not sound appropriate.
Ambassador Hale, you testified that you were aware Ambassador Sondland was involving himself in matters that, and I quote, went beyond the normal writ of an ambassador to the European Union, unquote. As you understood it, who authorized Ambassador Sondland to work on Ukraine?
I have no firsthand knowledge of that. I received a readout from a meeting that the President of the United States had with the delegation on May 23rd, in which the briefing I received anyway indicated that the President wanted the members of that delegation, which included Ambassador Sondland, to carry forth the policies that were discussed in the course of that meeting.
So that occurred in a meeting in the Oval Office on May 23rd is where you heard that information from the readout of that meeting?
A written readout from that, yes.
You testified that, and I quote, it was clear that the members of that inaugural delegation were empowered by the President. That's what you testified. You also said, and I quote, as a practical matter, it would be Ambassador Volker and Ambassador Sondland, presumably working with Taylor, who would be the ones really doing the continual effort here. Did you understand that Ambassador Sondland had direct access to the President?
In the few occasions in which I had conversations with Ambassador Sondland, he often would let it know that he was in direct contact with the President. That's all I knew.
So you received that information directly from Ambassador Sondland, that he had direct contact with the President?
In previous occasions, yes, not related to this particular matter.
Is there anything about Ambassador Sondland's role that struck you as problematic?
Based on what I knew at the time, I was satisfied that this delegation was what the President wanted to have, continue to pursue these policies. And I saw that Ambassador Volklin, who was a professional, had been a Foreign Service officer and an ambassador of distinction, and steeped in Ukrainian affairs, was part of that group. So I had no great concerns.
So what you knew at the time, you were okay with his role, but did your opinion change about the appropriateness of his role?
As I testified, I was not aware of these various activities related to negotiations over investigations, preconditions related to that. I just wasn't aware of it, so I had no reason to be making any kind of judgment one way or the other.
Have you reviewed the text messages between Ambassadors Sondland and Volker?
I've seen some of them that were reported in the media.
Were you surprised by anything in those messages that you heard reported or personally witnessed or observed?
I was surprised by what I saw in those reports in the media.
I want to ensure I understand your testimony, Ambassador Hale. You believed Ambassador Sondland was empowered by the President, according to what you found out from the May 23rd meeting, to work on Ukraine policy, and you said, quote, none of that really struck you as problematic because of the time differences there of what you knew. Is that correct?
Based on what I knew, yes.
Okay. You are the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. You testified that in that capacity, you are responsible for the management of the United States bilateral relations with, and I quote, every country in the world that we recognize for the management of our policies towards those countries, as well as our relationship or policies as they relate to multilateral organizations. Does that include U.S. policy and relations with Ukraine?
It does, but when we have a special envoy who reports directly to the Secretary related to a country or an issue, that special envoy will take the day-to-day responsibilities.
How about U.S. policy and relations with the European Union?
Yes, I am.
But you were not aware fully of Ambassador Sondland's activities on behalf of President Trump?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. Undersecretary Hale, you and your colleagues testified that you've gathered official records at the State Department with the understanding that they would be provided to Congress, right?
I was not involved in the decision-making, or I have no responsibilities related to gathering documents. I understood that it was underway. And I've certainly received the documents that I described earlier.
I see. In terms of the materials that were collected, do they include electronic files and emails, for instance?
I can only speak to the documents that were made available to me, and it did include emails
And paper documents as well?
and paper documents.
Would tape recordings potentially be among the files that are gathered?
I really couldn't speculate on that.
But you can't rule out that possibility?
I don't know of tape recordings, but so I can't really comment on that.
And are you familiar with from whom the documents have been collected, like the individual custodians?
I don't know that, sir.
You're aware that despite a duly authorized congressional subpoena has been served on the State Department, we have yet to receive even a single document, correct?
I understand that, yes.
Ms. Cooper, in the interagency process, did anyone in any committee potentially bring up the lack of allied funding as a reason for why there should be a hold on military assistance to Ukraine?
I can only speak to the three meetings that I attended, the PCC, DSG, and then PCC, and I have no recollection of the issue of allied burden sharing coming up at that point. I did provide information in my deposition about what I thought was a completely separate query that I received in mid-June from the Secretary of Defense's front office, and one of the questions there just asked a question about the degree to which allies were contributing to Ukraine's security assistance, just to be very clear.
Okay, but after the hold was put in place on July 18th, you haven't heard any concerns about a lack of allied funding as a reason for why the hold should be in place?
In those meetings that I attended, I did not hear that, or I do not recall hearing that as a reason. The only reason that I heard was the president's views on corruption. No further information.
Got it. Same question to you, Undersecretary Hale.
Could you repeat the question, sir?
I assume you didn't hear about the lack of allied funding as a reason for the hold being put in place after July 18th.
No, I never heard a reason for the hold.
You never, I assume neither of you heard any reason whatsoever for why the hold was in place, except for the fact that OMB put it in place at the direction of the president, right?
That's correct.
And I assume, one of my colleagues brought up the idea that the hold was put in place to assess whether or not President Zelensky was legit. I assume that was not a reason that was offered either.
No, sir, I never heard that as a reason.
I heard no reason.
Undersecretary Hale, what is the importance of a world leader having a meeting at the White House?
Well, really, it's case by case, but particularly for a new leader, it's an extremely important opportunity to demonstrate the strength of our relationship, for building of that relationship at a personal level, leadership level, to demonstrate common goals.
How about in the case of President Zelensky? How important was it for him to have a meeting at the White House with President Trump?
Well, I never talked to President Zelensky about that myself. I met him before he became president. I met with President Poroshenko and the two leading candidates.
But as an expert on these matters, is it fair to say that a new world leader such as President Zelensky having a meeting at the White House with President Trump is extremely important for his image that he projects, especially toward folks like Russia?
Well, an Oval Office meeting is incredibly valuable for any foreign leader. Let me just state that general principle. And for a Ukrainian president, it is indeed what you just said, to demonstrate that the bond between the United States and Ukraine is strong, and that there is continuity in our policies, and that we are going to continue to work together on our policy goals, including countering Russian aggression and intimidation of Ukraine.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
That concludes the member questioning. Mr. Nunes, do you have any concluding remarks?
Thank the gentleman. What have we learned from the Democrats' impeachment inquiry? They promised the country a fair hearing. What have they delivered? The impeachment version of three-card Monte, the notorious short con card trick where the mark, in this case President Trump and the American public, stands no chance of winning. The Democrats promised the whistleblower's testimony. In fact, they told us that we need to speak with the whistleblower. And then we learned that the whistleblower coordinated with the Democratic staff before alerting the intelligence community's Inspector General. To hide their con, the Democrats pound the table and gaslight the country, telling us that the whistleblower is entitled to an imaginary statutory right of anonymity. They accuse us of trying to out the whistleblower, knowing that they're the only ones who know who he is. They say that if the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. And if both are against you, pound the table and yell like hell. It seems at law school these days, it's teaching their students a fourth tactic. If the facts and the law are against you, simply rig the game and hope your audience is too stupid to catch your duplicity. This is not an impeachment inquiry, it's an impeachment inquisition. In the Middle Ages, the inquisitor was free to act on his own and bring suit against any person who was even vaguely the subject of the lowest rumor. And the accused was denied any right to confront their accusers. Incredibly, or maybe not so much, given the Democrats' track record, an Inquisition victim had more rights than the Democrats are giving the president. After all, Inquisition victims had the right to know their accuser's name. For those of you at home, it's time to change the channel, turn down the volume, or hide the kids, put them to bed. Now I yield to Mr. Schiff for story time hour.
I thank the gentleman, as always, for his remarks. I'll be brief this evening. It's been a long day, and I said most of what I wanted to say earlier in the day. But I did want to end this evening, and first of all, thank you both for your testimony and your long service to the country. We're grateful that you answered the lawful process of a congressional subpoena. I wanted to share a few reflections on two words that have come up a lot in the course of these hearings. And those words are corruption and anti-corruption. We are supposed to believe, I imagined, listening to my colleagues, that Donald Trump is a great anti-corruption fighter. That his only concern about Ukraine was that it would fight corruption. But let's look at that argument. Let's look at the president's words and let's look at his deeds. Ambassador Yovanovitch was an anti-corruption champion. No one has contradicted that has come forward to testify here. She was a champion. And on the day she is at a meeting acknowledging in Ukraine another anti-corruption champion, a woman who had acid thrown in her face and died a painful death after months, she is called back to Washington because of a vicious smear campaign by the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, among others. She is recalled. That is not anti-corruption. That is corruption. And one of the people responsible for this smear campaign, in addition to Mr. Giuliani, and it is a long and sordid list of those who were involved, is a man named Lutsenko, someone who the minority's own witness acknowledges has a poor reputation as self-serving and corrupt. And what do we see about Mr. Lutsenko and his predecessor, Mr. Shokin? What does the president have to say about one of these corrupt former prosecutors? He praises them. He says they were treated very unfairly. That's not anti-corruption. That's corruption. And when Ambassador Sondland testified today that there was unquestionably a quid pro quo, and everybody knew it, conditioning a White House meeting that Ukraine desperately wanted to show its friend and foe alike it had the support of the President of the United States, when that was conditioned, that official act was conditioned on the receipt of things of value to the President, political investigations, that was not anti-corruption, that was corruption. And when Ambassador Sondland testified today that he could put two and two together, and so can we, that there was also a quid pro quo on the military aid, that aid was not going to be released unless they did a public statement, Ukraine did a public statement of these political investigations the president wanted. That's not anti-corruption, that is corruption. And let's look at the president's words on that phone call, that infamous phone call on July 25th. Does he ask President Zelensky, how's that reform coming in the Rada? What are you doing to root out corruption? What about that new anti-corruption court? Of course not. Of course not. Are we really to believe that was his priority? No. What does he ask? I want you to do us a favor. Investigate this crazy 2016 server conspiracy, that the servers somewhere in Ukraine. And more ominously, investigate the Bidens. That's not anti-corruption. That is corruption. And the next day, when he's on the phone to Ambassador Sondland in that outdoor restaurant in Kiev, what does he want to know about? Does he want to know how Zelensky is going to fight corruption? Of course not. The only thing he brings up in that call is the investigation he wants into the Bidens. That's not anti-corruption. That is corruption. Every now and then, there's a conversation that really says all you need to know. And sometimes it doesn't seem all that significant. But I'll tell you, this one really struck me. And it was a conversation that Ambassador Volker related in his testimony. And it was a conversation just this past September when he's talking to Andrei Yermak, top advisor to President Zelensky, and he's advising him, as indeed he should. You know, you may not want to go through with an investigation or prosecution of former President Poroshenko. Engaging in political investigations is really not a good idea. And you know what Yermak says? Oh, you mean like you want us to do of the Bidens and the Clintons? Well, there's a word for that too, and it's not corruption or anti-corruption. It's called hypocrisy. And this is the problem here. We do have an anti-corruption policy around the world. And the great men and women in your department, under Secretary Hale, and in your department, Ms. Cooper, they carry that message around the world, that the United States is devoted to the rule of law. But when they see a president of the United States who is not devoted to the rule of law, who is not devoted to anti-corruption, but instead demonstrates in word and deed corruption, they are forced to ask themselves, what does America stand for anymore? That concludes this evening's hearing. I will ask the witnesses to excuse themselves. Members should remain. We have a business matter to take up. I have the ranking member's request that I concur as chair and the ranking member's request that the committee issue subpoenas pursuant to House Resolution 660, Section 2, Paragraph 4. We received that request this morning and will add it to the record now without objection. By way of overview, 2 of the requested subpoenas would compel deposition testimony by the whistleblower and by Hunter Biden. 3 other subpoenas would compel certain parties to produce records, the whistleblower to produce documents and communications related to the whistleblower's complaint, Rosemont, Seneca, Baha'i to produce records related to Hunter Biden's role on the Burisma board, and the Democratic National Committee to produce communications with Ukrainian officials and records relating to Alexandria Chalupa. I do not concur in these requests for subpoenas. We will not allow, as I said before, this committee to be used either to out the whistleblower or for purposes of engaging in the same improper investigation that the President sought to coerce Ukraine to commit. The committee will take them up now, beginning with the first minority request to compel testimony by the whistleblower. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to table.
Gentleman moves to
Mr. Chairman, this
table. That is
meeting has not
non-
been noticed, Mr. Chairman.
That is a non-debatable motion. All those in favor of table the motion,
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Point of
say
order.
aye.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Point of
All
order,
those
Mr. Chairman.
opposed, say no.
Point of order, Mr. No. Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me, the
Point of
motion is
order, Mr.
non-debatable.
Chairman.
Those opposed, say no.
Point of order, Mr.
In
Chairman.
the opinion of the chair,
Point of
the
order,
ayes
Mr.
have it,
Chairman.
and the motion is
Point of
tabled.
order, Mr. Chairman.
Roll call.
A roll call vote is requested. The clerk shall call the roll.
Chairman Schiff.
Aye.
Mr. Himes. Ms. Sewell.
Aye.
Mr. Carson.
Aye.
Ms. Spear.
Aye.
Mr. Quigley. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Castro. Mr. Heck. Mr. Welch. Mr. Maloney. Ms. Demmings. Mr. Krishnamurthy. Ranking Member Nunes.
No.
Mr. Conaway.
No.
Mr. Turner. Dr. Wenstrup. Mr. Stewart. Ms. Stefanik. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Radcliffe. Mr. Jordan.
No.
Mr. Chairman, there are 13 ayes and 4 noes.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The motion to table is
Point
carried.
of order, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will state his point of order.
Mr. Chairman, was this business meeting noticed properly within the rules of the House?
House Resolution 660 requires that if the minority makes a request for subpoenas, that we will promptly take up that request, and that is what we're doing. On the subpoena to
Mr.
compel
Mr. Chairman,
testimony
however,
by
Mr.
Hunter
Chairman,
Biden,
Rule 11 G
is there a motion
has
on the
not been
subpoena
honored.
to compel the testimony of Hunter Biden?
Mr. Chairman, I move to
Sure.
table.
Gentleman moves to table. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is now.
Roll call vote.
Gentleman requests a roll call vote. Please call the roll.
Chairman Schiff.
Aye.
Mr. Himes. Ms. Sewell.
Aye.
Mr. Carson.
Aye.
Ms. Spear.
Aye.
Mr. Quigley. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Castro. Mr. Heck. Mr. Welch. Mr. Maloney. Ms. Demmings. Mr. Krishnamurthy. Ranking Member Nunes.
No.
Mr. Conaway.
No.
Mr. Turner. Dr. Wenstrup. Mr. Stewart. Ms. Stefanik. Mr.
Motion to table is carried. The motion is now on the subpoena to compel documents from the whistleblower. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to table.
Gentleman moves to table. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We'll now move to subpoena number 4 to compel documents regarding Hunter Biden's role on Burisma board. Mr.
Chairman, I move to table.
Gentleman moves to table. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is tabled. The last motion is on the motion to compel documents from the Democratic National Committee. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to table.
Gentleman moves to table. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes Have it, and the motion is tabled.
Point of order,
We
Mr.
are
Chairman.
adjourned.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Chair cannot unit.